You've experienced roadblocks at work and sometimes wondered why it seems so hard and takes so long to get things done. You've seen workarounds work until they don't, and you experience bloated processes that frustrate everyone. You've told yourself there has to be a better way. In this episode, we will explore that better way, and that when used effectively can almost seem like magic. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders like you grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast, you can join us in the future live and then get this information sooner and be a part of the process. If you want to learn more about that and where the show airs and all those things, you can join us on our Facebook or LinkedIn groups, two of the places where these shows emanate. And so just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to find out more and get connected and find out when these are happening live. Today's episode is brought to you by my latest book, Flexible Leadership: Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. It's time to realize that styles can get in our way and that following our strengths might not always be the best approach. In a world more complex and uncertain than ever, leaders need a new perspective and set of tools to create great results for their organizations and team members. And that's what Flexible Leadership can do for you. Learn more and order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/flexible. And with that, I'm going to bring in my guests. Here they are. I'm going to introduce them to you, and then we will dive in. Today, my guests are Nelson Repenning and Don Kieffer. Nelson, Dr. Repenning, is the School of Management Distinguished Professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He's currently director of MIT's Leadership Center and was recently recognized by Poets and Quants as one of the world's top executive MBA instructors. His scholarly work has appeared in Management Science, Organization Science, Administrative Science Quarterly, the Academic of Management Review, and many others. Don Kieffer is a senior lecturer in operations management at MIT Sloan, and he has a different sort of background. He's also the co-creator of the dynamic work design group at MIT. He started running equipment in factories at age 17. He was the VP of Operational Excellence at Harley-Davidson, where he worked for 15 years. And for nearly 20 years, he's been advising leaders in a variety of industries around the globe. His guidance was instrumental in transforming both the production and technical development areas of Broad Institute, a Cambridge-based genomic sequencing organization, now an industry leader. He's founder of Shift Gear Work Design and also teaches operations management at AVT in Copenhagen. Together, and why they're here, other than the fact that they're really smart, together they put their experience and research together in a new book called There's Got to Be a Better Way: How to Deliver Results and Get Rid of Stuff That Gets in the Way of Real Work. What an awesome subtitle. I am so glad you guys are both here. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Kevin. Happy to be here.
So that is perhaps the best book subtitle of the year. And trust me, because of so many that get shown to me, I see a lot of them, and it's probably my favorite. So listen, I'm real glad you guys are here. And I really want to start with how you guys got connected. So Don, tell us sort of about the journey of you guys getting connected and kind of the journey that leads to the book.
Well, actually, I'm going to let Nelson start the story off, and then I'll finish it because it's a funny story.
Okay.
Yeah. So, so I started as a grad student at MIT, actually in the same group that I'm in. I thought I was going to be here for 4 or 5 years, and that was more than 30 years ago. But I was looking, as all grad students do, for a research topic. And at the time, all my PhD student colleagues were, this is MIT, were doing very mathematically oriented stuff. So they were developing new algorithms and, decision methods and stuff like this. And this was the era of the quality movement. So there was a lot of stuff related to lean production and quality management, so on and so forth. And I just felt like I couldn't compete. I thought I knew a lot of math till I got here. And then I realized I was in a whole different league of baseball than I had ever anticipated. And so I was kind of looking around for a research topic, and I ended up kind of happening upon a very heretical question, which was, did anybody actually use these tools that we were spending all this time and energy creating? And I started reading the literature and so on and so forth. And it turned out the answer to that question was maybe at best, and in many cases, not at all. Um, and that's actually turned out to be basically the question, in some sense, I've worked on my whole life, which is, if there's a set of practices that we all agree are good things to do, why don't people use them? Um, and so I started working on that. And at the time, the National Science Foundation had a grant program um, where, in order to get the money, you had to have an industry partner, which was a new effort for them at the time because they were trying to get research that was a little bit more practical. And one of Don's colleagues at Harley raised his hand at a meeting and said, "Yeah, we'd love to partner with you all at MIT." And so they became one of the field sites we were working with. And um, my contact there was the head of quality for Harley, the late Ron Hutchinson, and we were working together. And we were kind of walking down the hallway at one point, and Don comes walking the other day, and Hutch said, "You really got to talk to this Kieffer guy. He's a real mover and shaker here at Harley-Davidson." And so we ended up totally impromptu having lunch at the Harley cafeteria that day. And I think we were kindred spirits. Like, we were both really trying to figure out how to move the needle. And, Don will tell you more about what he was doing at Harley in a moment, but it really started, like all good things in life, completely serendipitously with a random lunch, probably a cheeseburger at Harley or whatever it was. And we've been working together ever since. So it was very lucky from my perspective.
And I
Okay,
started.
what do you want to add to that?
I started out quite the opposite path. A kid from Kentucky who had a lot of frontline jobs when he was right out of high school, mostly in factories, metal cutting lathes, hard, dirty work like that. But I was a problem solver. And then 25 years later, I was working at Harley and had talked my way into leading, as a manufacturing guy, leading the biggest engine project they'd had in a decade, the Twin Cam 88. And I was energetic, fired up, changing everything. And Nelson was like this very quiet, stern, intellectual guy. And so we had lunch, and I'm telling him all these things that I had done in this to get this project moving, and kind of break this wall down, break this wall down. And I showed him that I had invented a stage gate process by interviewing people, and I had no idea what a stage gate process was. So I showed him what I did, and he just looks at me and says, "Don, why don't you read a book once in a while?" Stage gate process was invented in automotive 25 years ago. And I went, okay. So then I started telling him this other thing I was doing. And I was like, "Oh yeah, just this thing over here." And he goes, "Well, wait a minute. I want to learn more about that." And I go, "Well, what do you mean? It's just some dumb little thing I did." He says, "Yeah, but Don, there's not a lot of literature on this. And what literature there is says you should do exactly the opposite of what you did. And your results are stunning. So I want to learn more." And I was clever enough as kind of this, I call myself a factory rat, as this factory rat to think, I'm just a loose cannon here. Maybe this guy could help aim me. And that's how we started. He was getting primary data and I was getting guidance. And together we've been fixing things and talking about how it worked for 30 years now.
So Nelson, I love that. Thank you. And that really sets the table for this whole conversation, which is fantastic. So Nelson, what's the big idea of the book?
Yeah, so I would say one of the things I've noticed in my career is that I always have the pieces long before I can see the whole puzzle, and the kind of puzzle, big picture, I think came together kind of late. But the big idea really comes down to most organizations, and if we could spend some time, if you want to go to the arcane details, a lot of the management theory that dominates what we do every day basically presumes that the world is a pretty predictable place. We use the jargon static.
It's not.
Yeah. Exactly right.
No kidding.
And actually, Kevin, the way that I try to demonstrate this when I often talk about this in class is we do this little sort of rhetorical exercise. Well, I'll ask students, particularly if they're from big companies, how long is budget season in your company? Meaning, from the day the budget goes into effect, how many months in advance do you start prepping, negotiating, and making slides and spreadsheets and so on and so forth? And, the typical answer I get is sort of on the order of 6 months for most big companies. And then I ask them, and how long is that budget accurate enough once you start using it that it's a good guide for action? And the answer typically is about a quarter, right? So if you think
Oh,
about
that's
it,
better than I thought you were going to get.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say about a month. But
Yeah.
anyway, go ahead.
you know, but best case a quarter, right? So that means we're spending twice as much time creating this thing as we are actually using it, right? And then, of course, as you know, you and all your audience knows, is that once the world has changed, you spend the rest of the year making it look like you're following that budget, when in fact you're not, because the world is now a different place, right? And so we talk a lot about workarounds, and again, you know, everyone is familiar, and they wouldn't be in the jobs they're in if they didn't have a big toolkit full of duct tape and safety pins and other things, you know, basically to meet their numbers now that the world is different. And I think the big idea,
And there are all sorts of implications
right,
and unintended consequences of that. And that's just one process.
exactly. And the big idea of the book is that so much of the creativity and energy of people in big organizations is going to adapt to this dynamic world, but they're doing it essentially under the waterline. It's all surreptitious because, you know, they're making it look like they're following the budget and the plans and the strategies when they're not, right? And so the big idea of the book really is that if we accept the fact that the world is unpredictable and that our impact on that world is also unpredictable, right? You know, all the big tech companies, you know, they invent some new product, they have no idea what it's going to do or whether it's going to succeed or so on and so forth. If you accept that, we're going to actually design and manage the work differently. And so you referenced earlier this thing that Don and I've created called dynamic work design. And basically what it is a set of design principles that says, if we accept the fact that the world is unpredictable, we might actually do things a little bit differently. And I think what Don and I have discovered is with that just one shift in mindset, the gains that we can unlock in how organizations work are really quite stunning. And I'm sure we'll get to this a little bit later. But I think the sort of corollary to the big idea is that people have no idea how much waste and churn and frustration and chaos underlies all those efforts to make it look like we're following the plan when in fact the world has changed. And so, you know, we could talk about the details, but the gains it has unlocked and the companies we work with have been so big that as the academic of this pair, I'm sometimes kind of scratching my head like, is this really real? But I've seen it happen enough times. I'm pretty confident that it is.
One of my observations is that everyone who's listening is nodding their head about everybody else's work, but not necessarily about theirs. Because we'll talk about visualization before, probably at least a little bit before we're done. So one of the things that you guys say early in the book, and we've already walked around it. So Don, I'm just going to have you address it specifically. And that is what you guys call the firefighting trap. And what I find is a lot of folks got promoted because they were really good at fighting fires. And what Nelson is saying is, like, we're creating them. So, like, tell me about the firefighting trap, Don.
Yeah, actually, this is the first half of Nelson's career in research. I've experienced it, but he's really.
That's why I wanted you
he's
to
really
talk about
studied it. Yeah,
like,
so
we'll talk about the real world for a
the
minute.
basic. That's a comment I really appreciate. Yeah. So the basic dynamic is work is going along. And then all of a sudden, for some reason, you get behind. Either it's a business success, you got more orders than you think, or a problem happened and things start slowing down. Maybe it takes you longer to deliver than the customer wants, but all of a sudden there's a need to expedite something. You know, in the old days in factories, they had a whole army of expediters that go through the factory and pick orders and pull them through the system because the normal system wasn't delivering it. So as soon as you intervene in the system and pick one job and put it over the other one, everything else slows down. Now, sometimes you have to do that because there's a fire or an emergency or a change in the market, and you need to make sure the right things are happening because your system can't respond quickly enough. But if you don't go rebuild that system to respond as fast as the market wants, that backlog gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And pretty soon, the more you intervene, the slower things get, and it becomes a reinforcing cycle. And so now you get people who gain the system because this is the way it works. And I get rewarded for being the guy who can go down and make this thing work and deliver it. And the people who actually make stuff work quietly get ignored. So now well-intentioned people begin behaving this way because that's the way it's rewarded. As work slows down, and then there's a priority list. There's a hot list, a double hot list, a triple hot list, because everyone knows the only way to get anything done is to have it on that freaking hot list. So then the chaos just boils and boils and boils underneath.
And like in like we all know of, the person you can go to in your organization, that's the person that can get stuff done, right?
And the funny thing is, the reason they can get stuff done is because they know the right people. They golf with them, they go hunting with them. And the way that the one big insight for me about this whole thing has been, this is a human system we work in. And if we design the work among that and sort out that complex web of human connections so that the work flows, then all of a sudden the right things are happening at the right time. That's the big idea for me.
I know we'll try to get to the idea of the human chain, which you just sort of intimated a little bit there, Don. But one of the things that I was thinking, and I thought this before, but as I was reading the book, one of the things I was thinking is, the more people, the more complexity. We all know that. And so many of our processes have so many people, and every one of those handoffs is one of the chances where one of these things could happen. So Nelson, since Don just talked about half of your career in 2.5 minutes, do you want to add anything to the firefighting trap before we go on?
He's a pretty good student, actually. He got it definitely right. I think the thing I would add to it, and I'll do this kind of chronologically, is, when Don and I worked together, this idea of firefighting was really kind of coming together. And it's interesting, just to kind of go to the human system a little bit. One of the things that happened at Harley, and we don't get credit for this label, is they had a set of project managers that a little bit later actually reported to Don, and he can talk about this. And, among those project managers, there were some of them that had the reputation that, man, they could get stuff done. Didn't matter how chaotic things were, their project was going to be delivered come hell or high water. And, we did a little research to try and figure out what was going on. And what we concluded was exactly what Don, mentioned is the way they got stuff done is they had better connections to the scarce resources they needed, right? So they knew the guy in the test lab, and they knew the guy over in the computer simulation or whatever. But I think the funny part is that some folks that we worked with changed the label from the firefighters to the firefighting arsonists, right? Because what they realized is that in the effort to get these projects done, which I think was totally good faith, actually, there was no malfeasance. They were setting the fire on the next year's project because they were stealing resources and destabilizing the schedule and so on and so forth. So after the work at Harley, I spent some time working in the energy industry, and we were talking before we got started recording. You had started there a little bit. And one of the things that was really interesting and scary about that is that they had this dynamic much more acutely, actually, than Harley did. And it's really easy to see in the context of maintenance, right? You imagine you got a big, complicated oil refinery. Maintenance is really expensive. Physical plant is a huge chunk of your expenditure every year. It's the easiest thing in the world to say, I'm going to overhaul that pump next summer, right? Or we'll do it next year or whatever. And we just postpone it a little bit. And then your revenue looks great because we're not spending as much on maintenance, and we can run more barrels. And nothing
pay me now or pay me later, right?
Yeah. And nothing happens, right? Other than you look good. And of course, it just gets worse and worse and worse. And then eventually what happens in that industry, because the risk profile is really high, is something really bad happens, right? Something blows up, or somebody gets hurt, or even worse. And what I sort of, kind of concluded from that, seeing it in these very different contexts, was sort of two things, which is, number one, I think almost every large organization has some flavor of this firefighting dynamic. It's more acute in some places than others. And again, we'll get to it in a moment. I think the cost in terms of the drain on your resources for your organization is much bigger than most people appreciate. And then the other thing, not to be sort of too sober about it, is something that I think senior leaders really need to keep their eye on, particularly if you're in an industry that has some kind of risk profile, because when it goes south, some really ugly stuff can happen. And again, I think one of the things that made the energy industry so prone to this is you can do it wrong in that industry for a long period of time and get rewarded for it. But when something bad happens, it's really bad. And Harley was probably in the middle, in terms of that continuum. So I think it's a very real thing. Almost every manager probably is dealing with it. And again, boy, if you can get on top of it, the gains for performance can be pretty big.
There is an underlying dynamic, Kevin, that really encourages this behavior, even among well-intentioned people, which is, I do all this kind of trimming and refocusing, get on the right priorities, stop training on the blah, 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 really fix the maintenance program. And the numbers go up. And 2 years later, I get promoted. Then poor Nelson comes in, and he's got something that's now been deteriorated, a lower, less stable. And this is Nelson's story. Then he calls me up and says, Don, how'd you do that? I said, I just cut maintenance. So Nelson will do the same thing until he gets promoted. And so it's just
And then
this
at some point,
self-reinforcing. And then the brain piece is that if I touch a hot stove, I learn really quickly not to touch that hot stove. But imagine if you touch the hot stove and you don't feel the pain for 2 years later. When you're driving your car, you blame that on the car. So that the human brain just doesn't connect the dots over those long spans of time. So managers actually are learning exactly the wrong lessons in this cycle.
and got promoted for the wrong things. So they keep doing those things because human behavior says, why wouldn't you do
It's
that?
all turned out well for me. What's wrong with you? Exactly.
This is not, I want everyone who's listening that if you're hearing this and you're sensing this in yourself or your organization, don't go to blame here, because that's not like, it's
Right.
just, it all makes sense. We got to get past the blame, because this is, well, they need to fix it. Like they would fix it, we wouldn't have a problem, right? They changed the budgeting process. That maybe, right? We could spend a bunch of time in the big idea of dynamic work design and the 5 pieces, and we're not going to get to all 5. I'm just going to tell everybody that you are listening to a conversation with Nelson Repenning and Don Kieffer about their brand new book. As if you're with us live, it's not even out yet till next week. You can still order it, of course. There's got to be a better way. We could get to all of that, but there's one other thing that nearly every organization that I've worked with in 30 plus years, if you're with them for any length of time, this word will come up, and that is silos. So let's talk a little bit, because I think so much of what follows in the book comes down to firefighting and silos. Like if we understand those root causes, if you will, those foundational things, that helps us make way more sense of the rest of this. So I don't know, one of you want to take silos, the risk of silos?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. And Don, I know will definitely dump in. I think one of the reasons that we know that there's got to be a better way actually is I think everybody has experienced it directly themselves in probably one of 2 places, which is either if you were involved in a startup. In the early days, startups tend to be very dynamic, right? At the Starbucks napkin level, right? You don't even have roles yet. You're just going back and forth. And, you talk to founders and they will often talk about, the best time of my life was when we were all in that crappy warehouse and we were sitting in the same room at rented tables. But then if you're successful, the organizations start to grow and people put in processes, which you need budgets, you need plans, and so on and so forth. But I think a side effect of that, if you're not careful, is you lose some of that dynamism, because now we need an HR function and we need a product development function and so on and so forth. I think the other place you see it is in crises. And, I'll just give MIT as an example. During the summer of COVID, I took my kid for spring break in March. I left, I was teaching a class. I came back a week later. There was a big chain and a padlock on the door to the building, right? So I was teaching from my kitchen table. And that summer, between March and September, when the students came back, we probably got more done in those 3 or 4 months than we had in the previous 10 years. We had card swipe terminals. Our friends at Broad did the testing for us. It was just an amazing amount of work got done. And everybody knows why, right? Which is kind of all the BS and the silos melt away. And we suddenly have a very clear target, which is we need to get the students back. And, if the dean had to go move chairs around in order to get people through the testing, he'd go move chairs, right? Because all the hierarchy sort of went away. So we know it's possible. And yet I think the sort of interesting paradox is that we know it's possible. We don't do it on a day-to-day basis. And I think, part of that reason is that the natural evolution, which I think has this roots in this sort of static view of the world, is we start creating these silos, right? We have HR and so on and so forth. And pretty soon, because people are not connected to the target of the organization, we start focusing on our local targets, which is, I need a bigger budget for HR or whatever happens. And I think the to get to the bottom line is the biggest technique that we have developed, and I know Dom will have a ton to say about this, is to get people to realize is that the work does not care what function it is, right? If you want to think of the silos as going up and down, the work kind of goes across. And when people start focusing on how does the work move through the organization, they can suddenly see all those barriers and kind of the BS that shows up much more clearly. And then the problems in terms of making the work better almost reveal themselves. And I think, just to say one more thing, this is pretty easy to do with physical work. And this is probably a theme that we'll come back to because you can see the work move. Knowledge work is 100 times harder because it doesn't leave a sort of physical signature, right? It moves from one silo to the next, but it's all completely opaque to us. And so when we can get people, our students, Don and I teach a class together here at MIT, are doing this right now, actually, which is for their assignment. They're sort of mapping how knowledge work is moving through the organizations.
Visualizing it, right?
I'll have them in class in a couple of weeks. And the first question will be, did anybody find anything embarrassing? And their eyes are going to be about this big, because they're like, I cannot believe how we do work around here. So once you can see how the work moves, that has become kind of our, magical, vaccine for the, to get rid of some of those silos and get the work moving.
The book is worth reading for the story about the clothesline, which is a story about Freddie May, as it turns out, which is somewhat irrelevant, except that story alone is worth the book, from my perspective. So, Don, before you add anything about silos, I just want to make this comment, and maybe this will resonate with someone. I say to people all the time, like, you can see how strong the silos are by what t-shirt are people wearing.
Exactly. Are
people wearing the Harley-Davidson t-shirt, or are they wearing the quality t-shirt, or are they wearing the second shift t-shirt, or like because however, that's how we view the work, is the circle we put around it. And the silos, in case you didn't know, are circles. And so anything you want to add, Don, to the silo thing? I've got a couple more things.
I used to say, ask people, where's your home team? Is it your department, or is it your boss's department with your colleagues where you work out a common plan and they have it done together that's all integrated? And most of the time they say, well, no, I have to stand up for my team and support my team. My team has got to succeed. And what happens is what happened to me, working for a $200 billion company that told the legal department to cut costs. So they went down to one contract, the same contract for an individual contributor like me as Halliburton, the supplier Halliburton. I had to pay my lawyer $5,000 to read the freaking contract, where it could have been a one-page thing for me. And it caused all kinds of chaos in the organization for every supplier. But for the legal department in my silo, man, it looks good. So I think we always go system productivity first. And because when you start getting the flow better and you get more flow with the same resources, by definition, everyone's productivity rises. Yeah.
And I would just add to that, Kevin, really quick. My office here in Cambridge is kind of on the border of biotech, this sort of biotech Silicon Valley. The whole industry is right here in Cambridge, Mass. And I've probably given a talk at every one of the companies here, and always on the same topic, which is, if you want to make silos one worse, right, put them in the matrix, right, which is, now we have, rows and columns. And I've given a talk to every one of them about, how they're managing their matrix organizations. And the problem that they have is not only do you have your home team when you're silos, but then those silos, despite, in addition to being kind of parochial, impose their own priorities on the work that's going through. And so if you're responsible for getting a molecule, through the development process at one of these biotech companies, you got to go to every organization and sell them like, this is the more important drug than the other one we're working on. And it's just a jumbled mess. And again, because people don't see the path that these projects have to follow through all these different stations to get stuff done. And again, the cost of this is just enormous, and I think largely hidden from most of the people that are, they just spend their day trying to get stuff done without sort of really realizing the crazy that they're embedded in.
There's a difference between activity and accomplishment.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's be clear.
Right.
The book talks about 5 core areas of dynamic work design, and at some level we've talked in some ways, even though we haven't walked through them like we might in a PowerPoint slide. We've talked about all of them at least a little bit. We've talked a little bit about the right problem and structuring for discovery. We've talked about the human chain. We've talked about visualization. There's one thing you say in the book, and this is before we sort of wrap up and head to the finish line here. There's a statement that you made, and I don't know which one of you, I've written books with other people, so I don't know which one of you is ultimately responsible. So I'm going to make the statement. You guys can decide who wants to comment. Here's the thing that I think is so correct. The statement in the book is problem formation is the single most underrated skill in management. And fundamentally, this whole conversation has been about that point of what is the real problem here? talk about that. Why is that true, and how in our organizations can we fix that?
Well, let me start, Nelson. Like most things that we do, we can't tell who came up with it. There's another story in the book about what's the problem you're trying to solve that I got from Mr. Oba, which has been a question that has like a virus spread through organizations that I work in. So we always knew it was important. And when we decided to start writing an article, I think Nelson focused in on that. He felt that was the most important thing. And I think Nelson, take it over from there, that the whole thing about problem formulation was important.
Yeah. So I think that one way to sort of go at this is I've been hugely influenced in my scholarly career by this basic idea that's now been in a lot of books, is we have sort of two ways of thinking, right? So a lot of people of your audience probably read the Dan Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. There's a bunch of different variants.
There's a lot more people that have it on their shelf or say they've read it than have actually read it. But yeah.
Yeah. And the way I think about it is, we basically have, conscious processing and automatic processing, right? And most of what we do, and that conscious processing turns out to be pretty expensive. So most of what we do during the day is just based on simple rules that we've learned through, practice. So, there's all this hype about large language models. Well, we all have the original large language model in our heads, which is that sort of automatic processor. That conscious processing, in my mind, is one of the most scarce resources that organizations have, right? Because we all have this high-powered computer in our heads, but we don't really want to use it if we don't have to. And so we want to make sure from an organizational point of view that people bring that to bear on the stuff that really matters. And I think the big insight that Don and I had is getting people to just state the problem they're trying to solve is a really powerful way to get people to engage a little bit more of that conscious processor. Now, to be fair, if there's any academics out there, I haven't put managers into an MRI machine yet to scan their brains while they're writing problem statements. So this is all hypothetical, but
we have brought them to tears.
Yes, we have.
They're full of solutions and full of attributions, but we ask them, what's the problem? And they stutter, stammer, their face gets red. They can't do it.
Right.
Or you have 7 people in the room and you ask them all to do it. And when you put them on the flip chart,
they're all different.
They're drastically different.
Right.
Exactly.
And so I think the bottom line is just getting people to be clear on the problem you're trying to solve just allows us to, break a bunch of frames and automatic habits and stuff like that. And, it's interesting. Don and I have taught this stuff a lot, and students in the beginning of the lecture, be like, oh, okay, yeah, what problem I'm trying to solve? Got it. I can write it down. And then we're like, okay, write a problem statement for your organization. And then suddenly they're like, oh, wait, this is a lot harder than we thought. But once they get the hang of it,
it's easy conceptually.
Yeah. But they're evangelized. And I think it really makes people much more effective. And, another way of framing this, and then Don could certainly chime in, is there is nothing that brings a bad meeting to a screeching halt faster than the question of, hey, folks, what problem are we trying to solve? So it's really a powerful intervention that's often needed.
When I resigned from Harley-Davidson, I went to my boss's, the president's office, and he wasn't expecting at all. I was one of the hot shots, blah, blah, blah. And so I said to him, Jim, you're probably tired of me trying to tell you how to do your job. He goes, yes, I am. And I said, and you're probably really sick of that stupid, irritating question. What's the problem you're trying to solve? Because he would tell me what to do. I go, that's great, Jim, but what's the problem you're trying to solve? Stupid. He goes, I'm really sick of that. I said, good, you won't have to do it anymore because I'm resigning.
All right. Hey, but before we go, I've got a couple of other things. I'm going to sort of shift gears here before we finish. Longtime listeners will know the two questions I'm going to ask you. But Don, we'll start with you first here. What do you do for fun?
I bicycle.
You even work now.
I bicycle. I bicycle way more. I would say I don't say I'm retired. I still work. I just don't have a job. So, but I spend a lot of time on the bicycle.
And Nelson, what do you do for fun?
So I'm an avid masters bike racer too. And then I also play a little golf. And for those of you that read the book, you'll see that my mother actually makes a cameo appearance as kicking my ass on the golf course. So that's even though she's in her 80s. So trying to regain my manhood is one of my main activities on the outside of work.
There's a theme about you getting your butt kicked at various activities in this book.
Yeah.
So you'll all have to read it to know that. So Nelson, what are you reading these days?
I just started a book called The Mindful Body by legendary Harvard psychologist Ellen Langer, who I highly recommend. She's on a bunch of different podcasts. So, and the thing that I think this will connect to a lot of the work that you've done that I've been sort of obsessed with lately is there's a lot of research that suggests that being curious changes our brain in some pretty fundamental ways. And so I'm starting to believe that's a leadership superpower. So that's what I'm interested in.
100% agree with that. Don, what are you reading?
Well, Nelson actually did talk me into starting to read a book here and there, but I'm reading murder mysteries. The Louise Penny series is the one I'm on now.
All right, awesome. We'll have links to both of those in the show notes, as we always do, and we'll also have links to this book these two guys wrote called "There's Got to Be a Better Way." Where can we find you? Where do the people learn more about the book? Like, what do you want to say about any of that before we wrap up, guys?
Yeah, so the book's on all the major platforms, so you can find it there. Please feel free to reach out and connect to me on LinkedIn. That's kind of my major contact with the folks out there. And then Don and I have a website for our little work design consulting company, shiftgear.com, all one word. And you can check us out there. We'd love to connect with you.
Shiftgear.com. Now, before we go, everybody, I have a question for all of you. I've been asking them the questions. Now I'm going to ask you the question. And it's the question I ask you every single episode. It's simply this. Now what? What are you going to do with what you just heard here? Now, before we started, I don't remember now if it was, I think it was Don that said, well, we'll try to be entertaining. And I had been entertained. And I guess I hope that all of you listening had a good time. But what I ultimately hope is that you take some action. And the now what question begs the action. What will I do as a result of being here? And maybe, like, I don't know what you wrote down or mentally wrote down. If you're riding your bike or doing something else right now, I encourage you to take a minute before you go forward with whatever the next thing on your list is to ask that question. Now what? What am I going to do with this? Maybe it's thinking about the fact that we have to think about work as being unpredictable and uncertain rather than static. Maybe it's something about this idea that the work doesn't care about what function is doing it. Maybe it's simply, I'm going to start asking that question, what problem are we trying to solve? I don't know what it is, but I know that if you don't take some action from this, the value that you get will be significantly reduced. Guys, thank you so much. I had such a great time with you. I hope that you feel the same. And thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kevin. A lot of fun.
And hopefully it was fun, everybody. And if you found this valuable, guess what? There's a whole lot more in the archive, but you may not go back, but you can come back next week. And the way to come back next week is make sure you subscribe wherever you're watching or listening from so you don't miss any future episodes. By the way, tell somebody else to join us as well. Do those things, and I'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.